who said that. Many would wonder, of course, which First Nations. Almost any of them could make a very similar statement, I'm certain. But this comes from, again, the Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8, who you've cited as being a partner toward reconciliation, and it's your responsibility to ensure that transfer, Mr. Barbosa made mention, rather than de-evolution, transfer of responsibility. But this position you're taking is causing harm. And I hope that you understand that. The convenient excuse to take a very legitimate expression of an Indigenous nation's right to self-determination should not, and albeit must not, result in the material loss to First Nations communities. But that's the fact. Even worse, the trust between ISC, the Crown, and Indigenous people has gotten worse. They go on to suggest that they don't even know what are the priorities of this government. What is Canada's priorities for First Nation? Is it housing on reserve? Is it eliminating drinking water advisories? Is it to prevent reoccurrences? Is it First Nation infrastructure? They don't know because you're not acting. You're waiting with your hands, waiting for someone else to raise their hand and say, we need help. That isn't the approach that First Nations deserve. That is not the approach that Indigenous people in this country are entitled to. They deserve a government that acknowledges their responsibility to the treaties, first and foremost. If you needed an example of what transfer of responsibility looks like, look at the treaties of our ancestors that made very clear how these things were to be done. But instead of acknowledging the relationship that First Nations people have largely demanded of the Crown, the Indian Act, Indigenous Services Canada Act, have displaced much of that responsibility to your ministry. And now your ministry is saying we can't until the First Nations do these things. What is it going to take to ensure that not only money, but fair treatment and understanding their concerns is truly met? We'll start with Mr. Tremblay, particular to the formula.
So, Mr. President, again, the formula, as I mentioned, is part of our tripartite agreement, and we've committed to reviewing the formula as part of the response to the auditor's report.
But why didn't you do that before?
Mr. Desjardins, I'll tell you what, your time is up, but I think you wanted an answer from someone else.
I did, but I do want to just
your passage. You're kind of in a catch-22 here.
Sure,
so you can come back to that, but we will hear from Ms. Wilson. So I'll meet you halfway,
please.
Ms.
Wilson, please.
Mr. Chair, we are certainly not taking the position to transfer programs and services where First Nations are not well equipped and well supported and well funded to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Mr. Brock joining us. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. My sole question will be to Indigenous Services officials. I have one question. I am the member for Brant. I proudly represent 2 Indigenous nations, 6 nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of the Credit. I trust at least someone on this panel has probably visited my riding from time to time. So I want to talk about an issue that has been plaguing my tenure as a parliamentarian, as well as my predecessor, Mr. Phil McColman. I wrote a letter to Minister Haidu on December 21st, 2001. It read, "The Gawaweni School is a federally funded elementary and secondary school located on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. For the past 30 years, the school has provided instruction to its students in the Mohawk and Cayuga language in grade 8, at which time English is introduced. There has been an application for funding in progress for several years for a new school to be built. The school is currently operating out of a privately owned lacrosse arena, and their need for a new building is urgent. The landlord has been extremely accommodating. However, the lease is subject to annual renewal. Therefore, the space is not secure and, most importantly, certainly not adequate for a school. The classrooms are cramped with no running water, and the majority do not have windows. The language instruction not only provides the students with an education, but also the foundation for their identity. No doubt you will agree that providing financial support for the construction of the school will also help to fulfill our collective commitment towards truth and reconciliation, most specifically the preservation and revitalization of Aboriginal languages and cultures. Minister, in short, the current facility is not acceptable and, more importantly, not safe for the students and staff. They have been without a proper school for over 30 years. It's been long enough. The school has the support of Six Nations Council and a shovel-ready project which should be funded. I look forward to your reply. Well, I didn't get a reply. I had to follow up with Minister Haidu on April 22nd, 2022, reminding her that my staff reached out to her office on March the 10th, 14th, and 28th with no response. This project is now just under $30 million to properly fund. When we were asking for federal funding, the cost was just over $10 million. Because of Justin Trudeau's inflationary policies, we have now almost tripled the cost. Justin Trudeau has spent close to $21 billion on consultants, but can't seem to find the money to fund this particular school. Today, I had the chair, Ruby Jacobs, crying to my constituency office saying, what does it take to finally get the Government of Canada to recognize the need to introduce this school, to have the funding there, to have the school learn in a proper environment? What are you going to tell my constituents? What are you going to tell the parents of the children? What are you going to tell the chair who is crying? When are we going to receive the funding?
So thank you for the question, and I am aware of the situation, and I will certainly follow up with
Not good enough.
my colleagues in education.
We've been waiting for 7 years for this government to write a check. That is not an appropriate answer. When are they going to receive funding? 3 years ago, actually 2.5 years ago, Minister Miller attended on site. We had the press there. We had all kinds of stakeholders there. We were thinking that Minister Miller was going to deliver that long-awaited check. All that Minister Miller had to say was, "I'm sorry, I don't have the best news for you. Be patient. We are working on it. There are other priorities in our department, but you will eventually receive the funding." That was almost 2.5 years ago. When will you write the check?
It's not my check to write, but I will follow up with the officials under whose program this fits. We do run schools at Six Nations. That is not the only school in at Six Nations.
Why doesn't your minister, this is to Ms. Wilson, why doesn't your minister, Minister Haidu, have the professional courtesy to respond to members of Parliament who are duly elected to represent a number of Indigenous nations? Why do I have to plead and beg for a response? This is shameful, it is disgusting, and I hope you relay the message directly to her, how disappointed I am in the way that she conducts her ministry. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brock. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, if we can get back to the study. But good to hear that all members here, I think, of all parties are in agreement that this is a very tragic situation, decades of underfunding that have resulted in First Nations being underserved in housing, and I would hope to see my Conservative colleagues voting with us when we're allocating money to First Nations housing. To the CMHC, one of the main objectives of this government, because there certainly are a number of programs dedicated to housing, and even though I'm a former banker and pride myself in being knowledgeable about the different financing arrangements, it can be quite complicated and difficult to follow. But it could be, and I'd like to hear from the CMHC and then Indigenous Services as to how First Nations are able to access these the numerous programs that are available for housing, and how are you working with the First Nations to facilitate and certainly increase the capacity of First Nation communities to access the different programs. Off the top, Kahnawake is a neighbor of my riding. It's not within my riding, but if they had a housing project that they want to do, what would be the first step that they would take?
In the National Housing Strategy does prioritize Indigenous people and people living in the North as one of their priority populations. So as of December 31st, 2023, I'm happy to say that we've committed $6 billion of the $43 billion that has been committed under the National Housing Strategy to Indigenous people and people living in the North. How we go about helping them navigate the various programs, it's actually my colleague Morley who heads that Indigenous Solutions team that is across Canada. So they do meet with First Nations and other Indigenous groups to help them navigate the programming and also help them with applications. In terms of building capacity, we do have an internship program that is quite successful that we fund every year, and we've also helped stand up the First Nation Housing Professionals Associations, and they are able to build capacity of First Nations as well, including we were talking about mold remediations earlier, Mr. Chair, so including in that area. So we are doing what we can. Morley, I don't know if you'd want to add anything.
No, I think you covered it very well. We have a team across the country of front-facing staff who go out into the communities and meet with the housing managers and/or whoever is managing the housing portfolio on a First Nation reserve, and we have great relationships, and we help wherever we can with respect to capacity building, but also filling out applications, processing applications, advocating for First Nations, all those things.
Could you talk to me about the Housing Accelerator Fund? Is that something that First Nations communities have access to?
So Mr. Chair, there was a portion of the Housing Accelerator Fund that was dedicated to rural and northern areas. So we did have successful First Nations actually apply through the Housing Accelerator Fund, in fact.
Have you seen as successful, what would be the rate of uptake? Is that making a dent in facilitating the construction of housing on reserve?
The program, as you know, just recently went through the application process and is successful, so it's a little early, but we can get back to the committee in terms of success on First Nations on reserve.
OK. Et je peux dire que chez nous,
in Chateauguay and Lacolle, we had some success with the Rapid Housing Initiative. It was a partnership between OSPL in Chateauguay with an agent in Kahnawake. Are there types of programs like that one? Do you see other partnerships occurring, particularly in the urban area?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, sorry, the Rapid Housing Initiative was one of the most successful programs in terms of building houses quickly or committing to building housings quickly. And I think the take-up rate for Indigenous was around 40%, if I'm not mistaken, of the total $4 billion of funding.
Thank you very much. That is your time, I'm afraid. Beginning with our next round, Mr. Smale, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to talk actually more along the lines that our block colleague was going, and that relates to outcomes. How are we measuring outcomes?
I'll let my colleague talk a little bit about what we have in our departmental performance reports as identified for outcomes.
Thanks. I think, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We measure outcomes in two ways. One is was cited as part of the opening remarks in terms of houses built and renovated, and that number across the two apartments in front of you today eclipses 30,000. The other way we measure progress is around overcrowding metrics and metrics related to household density. So those are markers of indicators of progress.
And when you look at the population numbers, what stats are you using? From what year?
Within Indigenous Services Canada, we've applied the 2021 census data. Thanks.
Okay. Now, what policies are you using currently to empower Indigenous communities to chart their own course, if you will?
So I mentioned earlier where we invested $223 million in housing managers, but more work is still needed here. There was also additional funding provided for training, certification, and ensuring those housing managers had the capacity to manage, even technical capacity and expertise to manage housing on reserve.
So we have had a number of reports recently over the years that talk about the fact that spending is up in these departments, but outcomes are not necessarily growing with the increased funding. First of all, why? But second, what is the department doing to fix this? And at what point can we see an increase in the amount of actual results for, it could be, we'll talk about housing here, we're talking about housing.
So the outcome for housing has been 34,000 houses built, but I get what you're saying. I understand the complexities in all of this, and I'll ask Nelson to reply.
It is an excellent question. I think 30,000 homes renovated or built is certainly a marker of success, but there's work to do. Maybe I'll point to some other success areas, and I'll reference since 2016, First Nations themselves reported an average community well-being score of 58, and in 2022 that average rose. In 2016, First Nations reported an average community well-being housing score as 68, and in 2021 that rose. In 2016, there were 17 First Nations that reported community well-being scores less than 40, and in 2021, that number is 2. Additionally, the number of homes as self-reported by First Nations grew by 4%, and the number of adequate homes grew by 6%. So we're seeing progress. I think there's a way to go. Thank you for the question.
Maybe to the Auditor General, who has had a few reports on this, basically outlining the same concerns and the same problems. Are you seeing that same level of attention to this problem? And
Are you talking about closing the gap?
Yes, and do you agree with the assessment you just heard?
So the funding that has been spent has definitely contributed to building new homes. We actually have an exhibit that talk about the achievement of that. We highlight that, in the report when they were looking at the gap, it was about 55,000 homes, I believe, that needed to be built. Here we are, 5 years later, almost 6 into it, and 80% of that is still remaining. So it means that 20% was built. So there's definitely progress. I guess my biggest concern is that this is a large gap, and it's a lot of money, and so you should have a plan to know how to fund that investment. It can't all be funded on day one, right? So there needs to be a plan to know how to fund that investment. There will be limited funding every year, and that's why looking at equitable allocation, increasing access to funding for some communities that don't already have it, is one of our recommendations. Really going after those further behind and trying to bring them forward first is the spirit of many of the recommendations that we have here. But it starts with understanding the whole quantum of the issue, and then having a plan to fund it going forward. But I do want to acknowledge that progress has been made, but will this gap be closed by 2030? In my view, unlikely, given how the few years left and 80% of the needs are still largely unmet.
So now we talked about this gap that probably won't be closed. It was mentioned earlier about that new approach, right? If we're just relying on program funding, it doesn't seem to be actually getting the outcomes that I think all of us want. Where do you see the change needing to be made, and how much of a new approach would you think would be necessary? Are we looking at a total overhaul in thinking? Are we talking about more capacity for First Nations themselves in terms of their own ability to monetize, that type of thing, to reach the goals that they need to achieve for their people?
I see Mr. Chair is looking to say the time is done, and I guess I'll answer it quickly and yes, all of the above, right? A fundamental shift means to really think about things in a different way. But to continue to say, well, we have X number of programs for housing, apply to those individually over here. We have X number of programs for safe drinking water, apply to those over here, is the siloed approach that, in my view, after decades, we're not seeing is working effectively for communities overall.
Thank you very much. Mr. Collins, thank you for joining us today. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks for having me, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Trombley, maybe I'll start with you. I think I read in a theme I think that developed in the report from the Auditor General was one of almost the haves and the have-nots. And the smaller communities, I think, were at a disadvantage in terms of accessing funding either through the department or through your organization for various reasons, and they're highlighted in the report. I've always found that many of CMHC's programs are urban-centric. I come from a large municipality. I served on our nonprofit housing board, and we have a team of lawyers, planners, and others who help us with applications that you put in place. And for small rural communities and northern and remote, and in this instance, Indigenous communities, they don't have those resources, and so many choose not to apply. So can I ask what your organization is doing to ensure that for small communities, and I think the term that was used in the report was application-based proposals penalize those without resources. What's your organization doing to change that narrative to ensure that the smallest of communities who deserve their share of the resources from all of those who are in attendance here today, how are you changing things in your workplace to ensure that they have equal access to those resources?
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned, we have a dedicated team that is across the country that works with Indigenous, First Nations, and other Indigenous housing, including remote areas and in the north. The National Housing Strategy also has $1.6 billion that's dedicated to Indigenous people and people in the north. So as I mentioned, Mr. Lindsted's team is around the country and helps them with applications. We've also tried to build capacity as we're doing this. So if a First Nation is doing their first application, Mr. Lindsted's team can help them. And once they've gone through an application for a program, they then can get better at being able to have the capacity to apply further. I will also say that a lot of our programs are across. Obviously, it's the National Housing Strategy covers the whole continuum and the whole country. And as I said, even though a lot of these programs are applications based, thanks to the work of Morley's team, we've been able to get a lot of applications through funding through these applications program. As I mentioned, the numbers around 12 to 13% of the overall NHS funding that's been committed to date.
Thank you. Something I didn't see in the report was the cost of providing housing. There's references there that talk about the challenges that Indigenous communities have in rural and remote communities in terms of transportation issues, servicing issues. I think they're referred to as essential services in the Auditor General's report. And your organization is driving innovation in the housing sector. You have an innovation fund that seeks to accomplish that. Rapid Housing Fund, I think, has poured tens of millions of dollars into modular housing, which every time that happens, it's driving innovation in that sector. What is your organization doing to assist Indigenous communities with lowering the cost of housing, where in some instances it can be almost double the cost of what we're paying for in urban areas?
So, Mr. Chair, I think the member has mentioned a lot of the initiatives that we have put in place to help with that. Modular housing is, and we've mentioned 3D housing is a very good step towards lowering the cost. Obviously, you've mentioned some of the barriers that exist. The other one being it's very seasonal for the Indigenous people that live up north or in more rural areas. So access becomes an issue. So we are working, as you said, with the affordable initiation, the modular housing. So we're looking at different ways to help communities build housing faster and cheaper.
Thank you. Ms. Wilson, can I ask about the infrastructure, the essential services? It's oftentimes a shared responsibility between three levels of government, including First Nations governments, in terms of the resources that they have to contribute to upgrade the same. Provincially, is there a plan with our provincial partners when it comes to water, wastewater services, when it comes to building new roads to get to these rural and remote communities where climate change has played a role in terms of creating barriers, whether it's low water levels that don't allow the shipment of goods, whether it's ice roads that are no longer there during the winter season? Are our provincial partners contributing, and what's the plan in terms of addressing financial issues with those partners where they may not be at the table currently?
It's a great question. They are engaged to varying extents, I would say. Certainly when it comes to roads and winter roads, we have a lot of conversations with our partners, but maybe I'll check with Joanne to see if there's anything in particular.
Yeah, maybe a couple of examples. So in New Brunswick, for example, Tobic First Nation has an agreement with the provincial government for a $22 million investment. We've, again, similar to the example I mentioned earlier in Alberta, we've supplemented that, particularly around, again, lot servicing, engineering, those types of things. And the intent there is to build 50 homes with that partnership approach. So as the deputy said, it's not even, there's not a program to which people apply, right? These are ongoing discussions and dialogue between nations in a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. Thank you.
Okay. I think my last question would be around the whole issue related to those small communities that don't have capacity right now to not just manage, but to apply for the programs that Mr. Tremblay talked about. Are there small communities that have raised those issues in terms of even being provided the resources that you've highlighted today that are available to them? Some may choose that or say that they're not capable because they just don't have the population to manage it. Can I ask what the plan is? Is it a regional approach that it will be taken by First Nations where, much like regional governments we see in rural areas, take a collective control over some of the issues that you're dealing with?
It's a very regionally based approach. I would say when it comes to things like filling out applications, 6 out of 10 provinces in our sphere, there is no application. So it's people working with people, committees, regional funding formulas, regional decisions that are made in partnership with First Nations. And that's just how it works at the local level. So but there are reports, there are things that we can probably streamline and do better when it comes to some of the paperwork. So appreciate the question.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Saint-Claude-Gagné. Je vais vous donner 3 minutes.
I'll give you 3 minutes. So we'll have a little bit more time than I initially thought, so you'll have 3 minutes. Thank you. I heard that you agree, Mrs. Wilson, that radical change, a change in paradigm is required. These are all big words, so I would imagine that with your meeting with the minister after the release of the report was quite tumultuous because we can see that radical change is needed. How did it go? How did this meeting go with the minister? She had the same feeling. We have consultations with respect to organizations and infrastructure. I will turn my floor over to my colleague very briefly, please, because I have a lot of questions.
First Nations rights holders specifically on this question of why so many programs, how to modernize, how to monetize, and how to bring more modern municipal practices to the First Nation environment.
Concrètement, pratique moderne, est-ce que vous parlez?
In concrete terms, are you talking about building capacity? And instead of just sending money out where there's no results.
But ultimately, it comes down to choice. And we have many programs. We have one housing program, but we have a water program, a school program, and sometimes those don't align with the needs of a community. So the community should be empowered to choose where those investments go based on the investments that are available.
Donc, enfin, un peu de liberté de...
So, finally, a little bit of freedom of choice for the communities. They can decide where the money goes. That's a step ahead. I'll agree with that. But is it enough? That's my next question. To go back to my original question about the reaction of the minister, Yes, restructuring is required. Will there be any changes in the budget? Because it's urgent, and we have to take quick action to completely change the way we deal with this whole issue.
Of appropriations is a parliamentary question, but I would say we were happy to work with the Assembly of First Nations in quantifying the infrastructure gap. We engaged First Nations for over a year on understanding what the delta was in infrastructure, quantifying that gap, and working with the AFN to cite the report that was published on April the 9th. And so we know that the gap is great. We have programs that we will fund at the highest level housing this year. We will fund water at the highest level.
C'était pas exactement la question.
That wasn't exactly my question. I'm asking you a practical question. In the budget that will be announced next week, will we finally see major changes in the way that the federal government finances various programs? Or we're going to have to wait a few years for another report to come out in order for these changes to occur?
Positive budget outcomes on April 16th, and we want to continue to work with First Nations to bring that modern practice into place, including the monetization of investments.
Excusez-moi, mais vous venez...
You've just said that you have a hope, but we're not talking about hope. You're the one who's going to define your requests when you talk to the minister. The deputy minister is, if she's not able to say, yes, there will be major change in the budget, that would mean that finally we would be aware of the various reports, lamentable reports that we've had, and it begins with a budget. So, and you're not able to tell me whether it'll be the case. And if that is the fact, then we've got a real problem here.
I would agree that the budget appropriation cycle is critical in closing the infrastructure gap, and like you, we eagerly wait for the results of April the 16th.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Next up, Mr. Desjardins, you have 3 minutes. I looked left when I should have looked right when Mr. Smale was speaking. He went over slightly. I gave Mr. Collins more time. I've done the same for the Bloc. So you have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do now want to just ask the Auditor General, in light of our discussion here today, you heard many of our questions, you heard our concerns, and in your own experience as our Auditor General, you've cited many times, not just in your own words, but in previous comments by other Auditor Generals, to just the lengthiness of this crisis. The length and the time in previous testimonies, you've said this is going to impact an entire generation. And as a matter of fact, it has. Could you comment on what you heard, and are you hopeful with what you've heard, not just in the response to your recommendations, but also here today, that the gap will be closed by 2030?
So I stand by our comments in our report that I believe it's unlikely the gap will be closed by 2030 unless something drastically different is done in the next, there's almost 7 years to go. So, something different really needs to happen. And it starts with understanding the gap and then having a plan to move forward and doing that with communities. I mean, I would be happy to come back one day and say all of these recommendations didn't get acted on because there's something completely different, and here's what's happening now, versus just continuing to say there's been little progress made on our recommendations.
When it comes to program failures, and you review many programs and you see failures often, and you see sometimes there's changes in those in that work. We've seen multiple decades now of this ministry in particular saying they're going to do the right thing, and then they don't. As a matter of fact, in your report, you suggest not only that they won't reach the target by 2030, but it's actually getting worse. We see from the Assembly of First Nations report, for example, that the number that they had even co-developed with the ministry in 2018, the number they came up with is now outdated because of inaction. And now that number's well over $520 billion in terms of infrastructure gap. My concern, and I think Canadians' concern, and I think Indigenous people across the country are concerned with how do we in fact get a ministry like Indigenous Services Canada, which on one side is asked to transfer the responsibilities to Indigenous people, while also attempting to hit these really incredible targets like closing the infrastructure gap by 2030. How can they make such bold claims when they're saying it's someone else's problem? Do you see a disjoint or a silo in your words?
I believe you're highlighting part of my concern that I mentioned in my opening remarks about the partial agreement with one of our recommendations, right? And that is, as I reflected on this work and on the work of my predecessors, to say there's been 20 years in this area with very little progress is why I am completely discouraged and why I believe We made recommendations to try and improve things within the current confines of policies and practices, but something fundamentally different is needed to change.
Is this the worst ministry you've ever audited?
That's a difficult answer to question to
Top
answer.
three?
There are so many individual programs and that are not doing well. I would
Mr.
think, and
Desjardins,
then there are so many that are doing well. So it's a tough question.
I
to
will
answer,
rescue
Mr.
the
Chair.
auditor from ranking her greatest hits. If she's inclined to think about it, she can get back to us on that. Turning now to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to open just with a comment, mainly directed to the CMHC, and not to sound glib, but do better. I mean, do better. I mean, that's my comment to CMHC right now, specifically on First Nations housing and the fact that you're using data from 2 decades ago. Come on, do better. And you know, I know the Liberals brought up the Housing Accelerator Fund, and I'll go broader to that beyond First Nations housing. Rural communities, small town communities, did not benefit from the Housing Accelerator Fund. The fact that the township of Mapleton, a rural community in my riding, was lumped in as a large urban municipality, I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. Not a single rural small town in Perth, Wellington, and in many rural communities benefited from the Housing Accelerator Fund. So I just say that program is failing, and I think, unfortunately, CMHC is to blame in partnership with the Liberal government. But to the matter at hand, I want to begin with Ms. Wilson. Can you confirm for us whether you've done any investigation as to whether any employees in your department are also contractors with other government departments?
We are doing that investigation as we speak. Yes, it's underway.
And when will you have results from that investigation?
I want to say that it's in the next month, but I'd have to double check with you what the deadline. It's the government-wide deadline.
And will you provide those results specific to our committee when you're completed?
Certainly.
And the alternative, how many contractors within your department are also employees of other government departments?
We'll include that too.
I appreciate that. Going back to the mold strategy, and this has been brought up before, I want some precision on this. So when did Indigenous Services Canada make the conscious decision to stop following the 2008 mold strategy?
I'm going to take a guess here because this is before my time, but I'll look at my colleagues and I'll look at Dr. Wong here. It was not a decision made on a day. It was a gradual inclination by First Nations of wanting to reduce the silos of various program entities within and wanting more flexible funding. So gradually there was a move towards providing that flexibility and ensuring that mold was an expense that was completely available within the programming that we have.
But I think where the concern is, and I don't want to put words in the Auditor General's mouth, but I think she talked about the data being available. And when there's no longer a strategy specifically dedicated to this very serious concern that has been raised in multiple decades, frankly, the fact that there's no longer the strategy dedicated to that, where the data is found, where the data is dealt with, it's a concern. So again, I'm going to push back a little bit. You know, when was this decision made? Why was this done?
I'll repeat, it was not a time and a date where a decision was made, but I would say that we do have environmental protection health officers that go in and provide testing, and they provide First Nations with reports upon a First Nation request. We actually make active offers to communities to allow our inspectors to go in and provide that, as well as prevention, awareness, and so on. But you know, you do have a point about not knowing precisely and exactly what the extent of mold is, and I think that's something for us to take back as part of this audit and be able to talk to First Nations and say, you know, actually ask the question on how we want to deal with that. Do we want precision on mold extent?
Well, and I would say to that, I will ask that question again. I will come back the next time you're before this committee to see what progress has been made specifically on that. I want to follow up about a survey that Indigenous Services Canada undertook in 2022, in which less than 10% of First Nations communities actually responded. Perhaps first to the Auditor General, what kind of concern would you place on the fact that so few communities, First Nations, actually responded to that survey?
I think it's difficult. There's always communities that don't want to respond to surveys. Like anywhere, you might receive requests for them in your inbox, and there's some you'll choose to respond to and some you'll choose not to. I think it highlights the lack of capacity to perhaps address something that is seen as not essential to the day-to-day for a community trying to deal with this. When we look at the survey results here, it was interesting in those that did respond was that so many of them don't have full-time dedicated housing managers, and I would tell you some of the smaller communities it's less than half that will have a dedicated resource, and it's a critical resource to wade through the application process, but even to just understand the issue and needs of a community.
Thank you. That is your time. I'm turning now to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Diab. I want to make sure it wasn't a hyphenated name, but Ms. Diab, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Chair. It's nice to have another Atlantic Canadian as a chair on the committee. So I'm a member from Nova Scotia. And in Nova Scotia, we have 13 First Nations communities in my province who hold reserve lands. There's some fabulous examples in my province. If I speak of Member 2, I'm sure all of you must have heard of Member 2. They have a development corporation that has existed for a few decades now, and notably Chief Terry Paul is the head of the organization. I was present last year when he actually won the Excellence in Business Awards for Atlantic Canada. So I guess I'm not a member of this committee, and I sort of subbing in today. It's a very large, huge topic when we talk about housing. We know we have issues in housing all over the country, but here particularly when we talk about First Nations, is there a discrepancy in the gap between the different provinces or the different regions of Canada? I'd like to, for whoever is able to answer that, I'd just like to get an idea on that. And is there great examples that you can share or that can be shared with maybe some communities that are not doing as bad as, or that are actually doing really good things with the other parts of the country? So who can help me with those questions?
I can start.
And then if I have time, lastly, I'll ask it now. I'd like to understand a little bit from the doctor on this mold issue that keeps coming up here today, but only if I still have time. So please go ahead.
I'll give you 2 examples and leave time for Dr. Wong for sure in the Atlantic, and as proud Atlantic Canadian myself. The deputy mentioned one of them in her remarks earlier around service transfer. So the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, that is a service transfer initiative that we have undertaken with them that is expected to be implemented in the 26-27 fiscal year. Also, there is a housing agency, First Nations housing agency, that's being developed by the Congress of Atlantic, the Atlantic Policy Congress of Chiefs. So there is a lot of governance work happening in Atlantic Canada, a lot of investment in developing the economy around this as well. So, for example, Abbotsford First Nation and PEI, close neighbor, they have also worked with both the federal and provincial governments to produce more housing, but also to start a company, a construction company run by the First Nation, bringing people home, having places for them to not only live, but live and work. And that is a huge shift in terms of building an economy that will enable the change that is needed to kind of shift the paradigms in terms of how housing and infrastructure is done on reserve. So with that, I'll turn it to Dr. Wong. Thank you.
Over time, there's been a decrease in the number of house inspections being identified by Indigenous Services Canada environmental public health officers. Started, a baseline of half of the houses, and I have to emphasize, half of the houses initially being identified as, with mold as an issue. And then 5 years later, there's been actually a decreasing number of houses and number of inspections down to less than a quarter. But still, less than a quarter, it's 1%. It's just too many. We'd like it to be down to less than 1%. And that goes back to the problem and the disparity and the inequities that need to be addressed. But part of that reason, the context of why there's been a decrease in those inspection of the number of home inspection with the molds is because of the existence, of programs from the housing sector, the housing programs, with funding to actually support the renovations, the repair, as well as the new builds, etc. From my perspective, on the public health side, much more needs to be done. We need to drive down that from 25% to less than 1%. Thank you.
So, not an Indigenous issue, but when we talk of mold, I think, someone like me or anyone, I think sometimes it's awareness as well that it's an issue. It could exist in so many homes and people may not even be aware of that. So maybe, yeah. But in terms of the disparity in the different regions and the different provinces, does anybody can comment on that?
Oh, if I may, Mr. Chair, I think I would point the honourable member to a few of our exhibits. You have to sort of piece a few of them together. 2.1 will give you the split across the provinces of where there are First Nations communities and the housing units in that province. Then if you look to Exhibit 2.2, we'll show you the needs that need to be, the gap that needs to be closed. And then I would point you to Exhibit 2.5. While it is it looks at some of the programs around CMHC and not the two departments, it will show you that there were how many percentages of the housing units were in need of repair and those of replacement, and the underfunding or overfunding based on the issue with the data used in their formula. So I think it would give you a sense by province, if you looked at those exhibits together, where some of the gap is, so where the housing units are and where some of that gap is.
Thank you. I am expecting bells for votes. We're also nearing the bottom of the hour, the half hour. I'm going to propose a truncated time of 3 minutes for government and official opposition members, 90 seconds each for the Bloc and the NDP. I'll begin now, and I'll look for consent to continue. Doing this will take about 15 minutes. So if the consent's there, we'll continue. If not, we will have to pause when the bells go. To the Conservative side, what did we say it was? Mr. Schmale, you have the floor for just 3 minutes. And again, you can use the full 3 minutes or you can stop at any time before that. So you're under no obligation, but we are happy to hear from you for full 3 minutes. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I appreciate the full 3 minutes. Ms. Wilson, I want to pick up where you left off regarding the inspectors that go into individual communities and take a look at their housing needs. How many inspectors have been requested to go into community in the past year?
Wong, if he has that at the tip of his fingers.
Yeah, but back in 2017, 2018, approximately about 1,200 home inspection requests, were requested, and then 5 years later, it was during the time of COVID. And as we all know, during COVID, a lot of the requests have gone down for many, many different services, and that actually went down to close to 600. So it's almost like 50% reduction in the requests.
So these are the requests, but how many communities actually requested that?
It's the number of communities that have been requesting.
Yep.
That also has gone down as well.
So if it's 50%, there's 633 communities, it would be something like 300 and something.
So this is to continue on the overall theme about building capacity and getting away from endless program funding that doesn't seem to be working at all. How welcoming or how interested are some of these communities to having an agent of Ottawa coming on their lands to basically point out issues that that department itself, unfortunately, had a part in not fixing.
You have a point. This is upon the First Nation request, and we won't go into communities unless they request the environmental protection health officer to come in. We try to make active offers. So these folks work regionally. So they're in Saskatchewan and they're in Alberta, and they're not in Ottawa.
As a First Nations woman yourself,
yes.
Like how interested would you have, an agent of Ottawa coming onto your land to explain problems that that department was responsible for not fixing? Where is that capacity being built on reserve, where we can get to a point where we don't have to rely on Ottawa to get their act together before they can fix the issue on the ground?
Well, they're not in Ottawa, and as a First
You
Nation,
know what I meant. That was a figure of speech.
Okay, so as a First Nation woman, I'm actually happy to have resources wherever I can to provide support, advice for the safety and security of my community.
Additional comment regarding that. Also, as we speak, right now there's a new initiative, which is to try to recruit and retain Indigenous environmental public health officers. And currently, about 40% of the environmental public health officers are Indigenous. But with this new initiative, especially supporting Indigenous people who want to become one, have a laddering opportunities working with academic institutions in order to perform that.
How many would be living on reserve?
Mr. Smale, that is your time, but your side will have one more spot.
I got that in before you said that.
No, that's not how it works.
I think I got it in.
That's there. When you're past your time.
I want to challenge the chair.
You go right ahead. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 3 minutes, because I will be voting with the Liberals on this one, Mr. Smale. So I'm sure I'll win that vote. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Today I've heard repeatedly that much more needs to be done. Over and over. Okay, are we done there? Yeah? Okay, I'll start again. Today I've heard over and over again that much more needs to be done, and I see that both CMHC and ISK have submitted in action plans. And when I look at the action plans, I see that all the dates are 2025, 2026, and 2027, except for the building code line or recommendation is 2024. Can Mr. Tremblay and Ms. Wilson comment on that?
Mr. Chair, I had the same question when I looked at the action plans. One, for example, said that post-2027, we'd have to look at funding. And I was told, and it makes a lot of sense, that the budget 2022 allocations for the next number of years had already been allocated. So to actually go and change the allocation, we'll have to wait until that timeline. So that's just one example.
Mr. Chair, we are committed to, as I've said, to respond to the auditor's report and action plan, and we are going to do every effort to actually meet the deadlines and even exceed the timelines if we can.
Ms. Wilson, in your opening statement, you had mentioned a preliminary action plan. Is that different from what we see here?
Sorry, the preliminary action plan that was referenced in the deputy's opening comments is the one that was tabled with the committee. Yes.
Thank you. From Ms. Wilson, from your perspective, and also based on what you hear from First Nation partners, are some of these programs working?
Nelson talked about some of the community well-being index indicators, which I was pleased to see were actually going up when it comes to First Nations in a number of areas. I would hope that anyone would be open to looking at that presentation at some point on the Community Wellbeing Index, because it is quite promising, and I'm hopeful.
What are you hearing in terms of changes and improvements from the community?
Many communities are, when it comes to First Nations, very differentiated. Many communities are still in crisis. They're still suffering. There's still a lot of issues there. Many communities are evolving and moving forward, and you have communities like Membertou who are doing great and don't really need Indigenous Services Canada to be involved. So it's a whole gamut and a whole range and a whole continuum of communities.
Mr. Tremblay, this is in regards to the $4.3 billion urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. Could you tell me more about this 10-year housing and infrastructure strategy?
So the housing and infrastructure strategy, is actually with Indigenous Services Canada. The urban, rural, northern strategy is the strategy that the government will launch in this upcoming fiscal year to address urban, rural, and northern challenges for Indigenous people. And we are creating a Indigenous center that will monitor the bulk of the money.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Thank
or
you very
manage
much.
the bulk of the money. Sorry.
Suivant, c'est Madame Secrétaire Desgagnés.
Miss, you have 90 seconds. Thank you. I'd like to go back to a previous point. We have to be very careful since the current government's been in power for 8.5 years. And we've read the conclusions of this report, and we've looked at the percentage of houses with mold. Maybe people are... I think that with the conclusions that are so devastating in this report and that we've read in other previous reports, I think we have to really look at, as was mentioned, there are major changes that have to take place. Ms. Wilson, I'd like you to concentrate on this. There will be more space given to self-determination. That's good. You know, self-determination is very important for me. Then there's a whole question of the programs working in silo. You have to give communities an opportunity to decide where the funding is to go. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Refer to in 5 seconds is this infrastructure modernization initiative that we're moving forward on. It's a game changer. Merci.
Comme 30 secondes presque.
Donc, on s'attend qu'avec ces changements-là, vous...
So with these changes, you're confident that you're going to be able to fulfill the objectives by 2030?
We have a national strategy that is looking at a 10-year work plan at this very moment. It was mentioned by the member before. I would work towards and continue to work towards meeting that timeline and that target. It's going to take more than the money. It's going to take financing tools. It's going to take a lot of work.
Ça prend surtout une question de volonté parce qu'on voit que si des
and a question of will. If this is such a devastating report, it's perhaps there's been a lack of confidence by successive governments in resolving these problems. Thank you very much.
Next, Mr. Desjardins, you have 100 seconds, please. 1:40.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Given that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are not on track to close the housing gap by 2030, considering that First Nations are still in deplorable need of health supports as a result of the massive epidemic that is mold in First Nations communities, I move a motion, to which I've sent to the clerk. I move that the committee invite the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Ms. Patty Hajdu, to appear for no less than 2 hours on the committee's review of Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, from the Auditor General, and that the Minister be scheduled to appear within 3 weeks of this motion. It's been supplied in both official languages, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. It does take a few minutes just to send it around. So, Mr. Desjardins, would you just read it again, please, and just read it slowly so we can all hear it?
Sure. That the committee invite the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Ms. Patty Hajdu, to appear for no less than 2 hours on the committee's review of Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, from the Auditor General, and that the Minister be scheduled to appear within 3 weeks of this motion. And I would like to move it.
All right, then. Let me just check with the clerk here. Hold on. Members, I'll turn to you. It's going to take, 2 minutes to send. I am happy to start the debate on this, or I could... all right, Mr. Nader, you have the floor.
I will simply say that we support this motion.
I was hoping for more than 2 minutes, but okay. Ms. Shanahan?
Do we have insight into whether the minister is appearing on INAN? Because I mean, I fully respect the gravity of this issue, but as we've said before, this committee is about process and accountability and the finances and so on, whereas policy is at INAN. Chair, would you be aware of that?
I believe Mr. Smale is. So if you would yield to him, we'll hear from him, but I can come back to you. You will not lose your. I'm going to go to Mr. Smale first, and then I think back to Ms. Shanahan, and then to you, Mr. Desjardins. But go ahead, Mr. Smale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And to answer Ms. Shanahan's question, as one of the vice chairs of INAN, Ms. Haju did appear for a very short session. We got cut off because of votes, I do believe, if memory serves. But there were still so many unanswered questions that we still needed investigating. So we, as Mr. Nader said, support the motion.
When was that appearance?
Oh, it was probably, we're in April. It was March.
Okay, and then more pertinent, she's not scheduled to appear again.
4 weeks ago.
Yeah, it was well over a month.
Okay, and she's not scheduled to appear again at your committee?
We apparently have put out 2 requests for estimates, mains and supplemental Bs. Believe it or not, still no
Okay,
response.
so I'm going to say there's an invitation out, but no response. Ms. Shannon, I'll go back to you if you want the floor. If not, I'll go to Mr. Desjardins.
Well, I'm just suggesting that if indeed it is that the minister is appearing at INAN on this topic, of course, any member can attend the INAN meeting and ask questions and so on. We have a work plan. We're trying to follow it. We have, as you know, Chair, multiple reports at this time. I think we're up to 9 or 10 draft reports, that we haven't yet submitted. This has been a very fruitful meeting. We're going to want to certainly get to the report and get that out as soon as possible. But I don't know if Mr. Desjardins has spoken with anybody on, who's sitting. Are you sitting on the INAN committee? Yeah.
Yes, I will. Please respond. And then I do have to look for UC, but I'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, exactly. So the motion is specific to the Auditor General's report. This committee is seized with the Auditor General's report. And I often believe that out of the many audits we have, the Auditor General has been clear that this is of the most critical importance. 20 years of non-accountability, 20 years of underfunding, 20 years of not taking this seriously. That's why I believe, Mr. Chair, that this motion is in line with our committee's mandate, but even more so, it's a moral, but also it's probably the best and most important way we can actually address our oaths of office. Canadians are suffering, Indigenous people are suffering. This is extreme instance of inequality. We need to do this. It's not a question of where we should put this. This should be the government should be seized with this issue across all committees, if anything.
Madame Desgagnés, brièvement, s'il vous plaît.
Very briefly, I'd simply repeat what my colleague, Mr. Desjardins, said. I think this is a significant report. It's a report that follows on a series of other devastating reports. I would like to hear from the minister. I would like her to give us some instruction with respect to the AG's report. We heard from the vice chair of the INN committee that the minister wasn't able to answer those questions, so I think that we should have her here. Thank you.
I do need to address the Bell issue. I do want to thank the governing members in particular for allowing a few voices to be heard. I think that shows your goodwill on this question. I'm going to look for UC to look. We have votes coming up. I think everything's said that needs to be said. Having said that, could I look for UC to, and I want the Liberals to hear this. I'm going to look for UC to call a vote on this. So I need your attention, because I just want to make sure you understand. Looking for UC to call a vote. Yes, on this motion
right
yes,
now.
Yes. I mean, otherwise we could debate it. We have 20 minutes till vote, or 25 minutes to vote.
Okay. I just have one intervention.
Okay, then,
further.
then I'll tell you what. I'll check
Yeah.
back. All right, we're gonna let me have UC then to
No,
continue
yeah.
the debate for 15 minutes, and then we can check in again. Would that be sufficient? So that way you could
Yeah,
can speak, and you could
for
easily
15
filibuster for
minutes,
15
we'll
minutes if you don't want to have a
continue.
vote. So,
Yeah.
all right,
Yeah,
all right.
exactly,
So UC
yeah.
to continue. Witnesses, if you can just bear with us, please. Looking for UC to continue this debate for 15 minutes. All right, and then yes, Ms. Shanahan. Oh yes, any dissenters? None. Very good, Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor, Ms. Shanahan.
Yeah, I'm still unclear on the situation at INAN. We do have the Auditor General with us. If the Auditor General can respond, if she's been invited to INAN committee on this report, on report number 2.
Okay. We're now debating a motion, so we really cannot hear from witnesses unless members agree that we can hear from the AG. Yes, Ms. Hogan, thank you.
I'm honored. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I walked into the room, my parliamentary liaison people confirmed that I had just been invited to appear before INAN to discuss both the policing and housing. I do not know a time or a date, and I don't know if it's two separate or one, but yes, an invitation has been extended.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Shanahan.
In that case, and so that's new information, but if the minister has already been invited to INAN, then I would humbly suggest that would be a very fruitful meeting in the INAN committee, much in the same way that we invited INAN to look at the overriding issues that the Auditor General brought up concerning, I think it was Mr. Genuis's motion to look at the overarching issues that have been brought up in this report and other reports concerning Indigenous services in this country. So, Chair, again, I am more accustomed to working on a consensual basis, where we talk about what we need to do and work out our work plan, and we have a subcommittee, and it's discussed again in the group. I'm certainly not against
just one second.
that we pursue this.
I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Further.
I'm going to have to stop you just for one second. Not cut you off. I do a point of order. I need to hear the point of order.
I raised a point of order on relevance. Ms. Shanahan asked the question to the Auditor General. The Auditor General responded.
Yes.
I believe that exhausting our remainder amount of time before we get to a vote is inappropriate.
Okay. Well,
and
okay.
we should get to a vote.
Mr. Digely, that is might be an observation. Is not a point of order, and Ms. Shanahan has the floor. I can appreciate your frustration because the clock is ticking. I'm going to go back to Ms. Shanahan. As you know, I cannot cut off debate. Debate goes till it collapses, then I call a vote. Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor.
Yeah, Chair. So I just again in a spirit of working together, we've had other motions of this type that have come forward because of the urgency of the moment, but that the different parties were consulted beforehand, so we could at least have an idea of where we were, of where we're headed. So it's just in that spirit, Chair, that I would just like to put it to my colleagues that this committee has already has its time taken up considerably by the work of another committee, government operations. Initially. We have, in my opinion, actually duplicated a lot of work that's happened. It's not also necessarily the case that Auditor General reports are only studied in our committee. In fact, we're a starting point, and then they go to other committee where they can be discussed more fulsomely. So with that, Chair, I propose the following friendly amendment, maybe concerning the timeline, that we do the invitation to the minister. Sorry, do I have the text? Sometime we're in April now, in May, given the timeline that we have before us, as our meetings are scheduled for the next couple of weeks.
So just
yeah,
I'm gonna come back to you in 10 seconds, just to be more clear, Mrs. Shannon, because I'm not quite sure what your amendment is. In the meantime, I'd like to excuse the witnesses. Thank you very much for appearing today. We all appreciate it. And on that, you are free to go. This committee will continue to address this question for another 10 minutes. Ms. Shannon, I'm going to turn the floor back to you because you are proposing an amendment. But did you know what she was proposing? No. Yeah, we're looking for some clarity on that, Ms. Shannon. But of course, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So I do have the text before me. So in the last line, so to delete within 3 weeks of this motion to read as to appear May 31st. Sorry.
By May 31st?
By May 31st. Have I got the right calendar here? Yeah. By May 31st.
Thank you. With an amendment on the table to modify the motion so it reads by May 31st. Mr. Jejel, you had your hand up previously, but it's your motion. I'll hear from you, please.
No, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I am incredibly frustrated by the lengths and attempts of the government to go so far as to ensure Indigenous people continue to wait, continue to delay. It's been over 20 years. It's unbelievable that we would be even debating an amendment about extenuating time for the government when this has been over 20 years of problems. Forgive me for my amount of frustration that this has given me, but I need you to sympathize and understand that as we debate this, about making sure that the minister has an opportunity to review all the information and to have a big, long dialogue about how she can skirt her responsibilities, I believe that Indigenous people should get the level of understanding, transparency, and accountability that's needed in this government. And the only way to do it is by ensuring that we actually hear from the minister. The questions we pose today are departmental questions, and yes, they're important questions, but the Auditor General has been very clear that this is of utmost importance, like 20 years. This is the problem in our country. This is the greatest issue facing Canadians in many ways. If we can't actually ensure that we have fairness, equality, equitability, what do we stand for? You know, like what actually do we stand for as a country if we can't ensure that a kid doesn't spend his whole life in a house full of mold? Like, I don't think you understand the gravity of this emergency. I'll share with you a story of a boy I grew up with who committed suicide in his mold house he was my neighbor. They believed there was never going to be a chance for him to grow up. We have no time to wait for this. And to the Liberal Whip's office, you need to understand that this is an emergency. And your amendments and your procedural tactics to delay, your filibuster are not appreciated. This is a serious issue that I believe we can actually have nonpartisanship on. If only the government were to see this as an important issue to follow up with that requires all of our attention. I need that from the governing members here, who are members of the Public Accounts Committee, who've been told by the Auditor General this is an emergency and are requesting more time. I simply, Mr. Chair, I cannot allow for that kind of excuse. The minister owes Indigenous people a responsibility. She is the minister of the Crown responsible for this immense emergency. And the government and the Liberal Party needs to understand that 3 weeks is already generous when we have people who are waiting in moldy homes. I'm not okay sleeping every night knowing that other people in our country are either sleeping in moldy homes, sleeping on a street, or are dying. The minister had 20 years. The government had 20 years. We have no more time to wait. Mr. Chair, I would not entertain